Hello everyone and welcome to this CIWEM event. I'm Alice Gent, the chair of the CIWEM Scottish branch. I'll just give you a few minutes so anyone who's got any technical issues can post it on the chat. But in the meantime, I'd just like to welcome you all to this event. And before we hand over to our speaker, I'd just like to draw your attention to a few CIWEM events that we have coming up. So firstly, on the 13th and 14th of October, we have the Flood and Coast Conference. This was originally going to be an in-person event that's been transformed to a series of digital sessions focusing on climate resilience, climate emergency, digital innovation and innovative investment. Then on the 21st of October, we have a presentation looking at 25 years of phosphorus removal in Severn Trent. At the start of November, we then have a webinar on the survey for river models. And then on the 17th and 19th of November, we have the UDG annual conference. I can't see any issues with this at the moment. The host has just put a link to the Flood and Coast event on the chat. If anyone who is keen to read more about that can do so. And now I'll hand over to Charlotte, who's going to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Hello everyone, hope you can hear me okay. So tonight's talk is going to be looking at unearthing a hidden cycle in the UK water extremes. So tonight's webinar is hosted by Will, who's a senior hydrologist with Atkins, and he has 10 years experience leading projects in flood risk alleviation and water resource management. For the past 5 years, Will has held a research position at Cranford University, investigating links between climate systems and oscillatory patterns in terrestrial hydrology. I'd like to ask if you've got any questions during the presentation, if you could please write these within the Q&A section. If you just hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, it should appear, and then we will collate these and address these at the end of Will's presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Will to hear more about this fascinating topic.
Thanks, Charlotte. Let's get my screen sorted out here. Okay, here we go. I don't even need to do my introduction, so that's the first thing off my list crossed out. So I'm going to be talking through some the papers that we've been working on as part of this research project for the past however many years. My computer actually blue screened this morning, so I'm really hoping that we can make it through this presentation, so fingers crossed. And as Charlotte said, I'm going to be talking about some research that we've been looking into, trying to explore the periodic behaviours in UK, principally streamflow, but also groundwater, and how that relates to climatic systems and how that relates to hydrological extremes in the UK. Now, like all of you, I'm sure, I like to spend my evenings trawling the internet for historical accounts of river flooding and river behaviour. And this is one that I came across quite recently. It's by Thomas Frost in 1881. It's Croydon to the North Downs, a handy guide to rambles in the district. Disclaimer, I didn't actually find this, someone sent it to me, but it works better if I found it myself. It talks about a little river in the southeast of England called the Bourne. This is the biggest bit of text that's in this entire presentation, so I'm just going to read it out to you. Ordinarily, the Bourne is a tiny stream flowing over a shallow, pebbly bed, often dry in the summer, by the side of the road from Smitham Bottom to Croydon, where its little rill serves to augment the water of infant Wandle. But every 7th year, it swells to an extraordinary manner, rushing along its narrow bed like a torrent, overflowing the whole of the roadway and invading the dwellings of the inhabitants of the low-lying quarter of Croydon known as Old Town. This singular phenomenon has been observed for centuries, and yet its cause is still an unfathomed mystery which nature guards most jealously. I really wish books were still written like that. But this idea of a 7-year cycle in, or really any cycle greater than 1 year in streamflow is not something that we as hydrologists are necessarily used to dealing with, I don't think. I think it's fair to say that our conceptualization of the behavior of streamflow is based on a few degrees of freedom, really, and that is fine scale variability as a result of response from storm events and event-based responses, seasonality, the annual cycle, and some sort of monotonic increase as a result of the climate crisis, whether that is an increase in the mean or an increase in the amplitude of the annual cycle, but nevertheless a long-term slow trend. And I've been looking through some of the river flow records in the UK, and the Clyde at Daldowie, I think, is actually a pretty good representation of this conceptualization. This is a flow hydrograph on the bottom of the screen here, and you can see that there's some fine scale variability in response to storm events. We have some annual variability, wet in winter, dry in summer, and visually you can see maybe some perhaps increasing of the seasonal cycle as a result of the climate crisis. But I think this generally is quite reflective of our conceptualization of streamflow as being something that, in terms of cycles, principally operates on an annual cycle. And a lot of the ways that we manage and measure streamflow is actually based on this assumption that seasonality captures the most important modes of variability. So we have annual exceedance probability, principally, well, not principally, but as one of the examples, obviously assumes that by looking at things as an annual scale, you are seeing the greatest variance on a yearly basis. Things like even standard average annual rainfall and and average annual recharge, that's the thing I was trying to think of, average annual recharge from the water resources perspective, all make the assumption that if you look at the annual scale, you are capturing a sufficient amount of the behavior of the data for you to make your decisions. So if we take this hydrograph and put it through what is essentially a glorified guitar tuner, we can spit out this, which is a frequency representation of the data. So like a guitar tuner, you play it guitar. I'm not very musically inclined, so forgive me if I get all this wrong. You play music to a guitar tuner, and it tells you what for the sake of argument, what the loudest notes are in the data set, in the song you're playing it, or the guitar tune that you're playing to the guitar tuner. And in the Clyde at Daldowie, the strongest note, the loudest note, is that of an annual cycle, is that of a seasonal cycle. Oh, hello. So that's the seasonal cycle there. You can see frequency or in years along with the x-axis there. The y-axis is relative, so I've removed it. But this, I think, is a pretty good representation of that conceptualization in terms of periodic behavior. We look at streamflow and we principally understand it as something that oscillates on a seasonal basis, and anything greater than 1 year, there isn't really any behavioral information that's of any use to us. And that's what this research project is looking at, essentially. If we apply this guitar tuner methodology to a wide range of river flow data sets, what kind of periods come out of that data set? What is common among different catchments, what is uncommon about different catchments? So I'm just going to throw all the data at you, essentially, and then we can talk about it. This guitar tuner methodology was applied to the National River Flow Archive. Now, there's an incredibly large number of streamflow gauges in the National River Flow Archive, but we identified 700 odd that was suitable to use in this project, that had, reasonable time coverage and reasonable few data gaps. And if we stack all of those guitar tuner outputs, those spectra on top of each other, so that we can compare where has similar and dissimilar frequencies, periods, we get this picture in front of us. And there's a few things that are interesting, I think. The first is that, quite naturally, the strongest cycle in the majority of streamflow is that of an annual cycle. That makes sense. You know, there's a reason why all of our methods for understanding streamflow hydrology, streamflow behaviour at least, is based on the assumption that seasonality is pretty strong. There's also a lot of noise going on. You know, there's some periods here that aren't lining up. So perhaps between 2 to 4 years, there's some strength here, but there's nothing really consistent across all the streamflow gauges. But what is interesting is that the majority of streamflow gauges exhibit a 6 to 8 year cycle to a lesser or greater degree. And you can see that, much like the annual cycle, the majority of streamflow gauges actually align on quite a narrow band here. And you know, beyond the 8 year, we start to see some a reduction in the how strong the signals are. And again, so sort of between 8 and 32 years, it's all a bit noisy. There's nothing really consistent there. So obviously, this is a methodology that has makes some assumptions in its own right. It could just be the case that all of this is noise and all of this is nonsense. So what we do is we apply a significance test to each of these lines to understand how confident we are that these signals are true and not just the result of noise. And that's what these squiggly lines are. So the lighter the color, the more confidence we have, with the yellowy white color essentially being 95% confident that these are signals that are driven by an external form of variability, not purely a function of the internal noise of the data set. So we have, in the majority of streamflow in the UK, and you can see on the map on the right, top right, that these sites cover quite well the UK. We have a cycle that is apparent in the majority of data sets, is in some cases comparable to seasonality, and is significant across the majority of data sets as well. And this significance testing also starts to filter out some of the other information that we maybe not too interested in. So between 2 and 4 years, they may be a little bit stronger, but we can see that they're not particularly very significant. So it's maybe not worth looking at. And the longer frequencies, sort of 8 years plus, whilst we can show that they're significant, we can have more confidence in them, then generally quite low and they don't align. So really just to hammer home the fact that this 6 to 8 year cycle is clearly shown in the frequency spectra of streamflow gauges across the UK. And if we go back to Thomas Frost for a second, and the Bourne, this tiny stream, he says, this singular phenomenon has been observed for centuries. We unfortunately don't have, in this study at least, the streamflow for the Bourne, but we do have streamflow for the Wandle, which is just downstream, and they share much of the same catchment. So we can show empirically for the first time that the Wandle, and by extension, the Bourne, has a strong 6 to 8 year cycle, which is, I mean, if nothing else, proves the people of Croydon correct in their assertions 140 odd years ago. But where does it come from? I hear you yelling at the back of the, well, virtual auditorium. Good question. Well, the answer is the North Atlantic Oscillation, caveat maybe. For those of you who aren't massive North Atlantic Oscillation heads, I'm going to give a quick primer on the North Atlantic Oscillation. In the North Atlantic region, there are 2 semi-permanent centers of pressure that tend to operate in unison. We have a low pressure system over Iceland, and we have a high pressure system over the Azores just off the coast of Portugal. And as I said, these 2 pressure systems tend to magnify and diminish in unison. The low becomes, well, I won't go to that, I'll actually use an example. The relationship between these two pressure systems is essentially called the North Atlantic Oscillation. And we call this a teleconnection. And the reason why we call it a teleconnection is because, as I said, both of these pressure systems tend to operate in unison. They have a connection over a long distance, teleconnection. In a positive phase of this teleconnection, the low is lower than average and the high is higher than average. And what this does is it creates a stronger pressure gradient from south to north over the Atlantic. And this pulls up the jet stream and to an extent pulls up the Gulf Stream and pushes more warmer, wetter conditions to Northern Europe, in Europe in general, particularly the UK. And by extension, that produces cooler and drier conditions in Southern Europe. When we have a negative NAO, the lower is higher than average and the higher is lower than that. Doesn't really make any sense. They're less intense. The pressure gradient between the two is less intense. And we see a relaxation of the jet stream. And this arrow isn't actually correct, it's more squiggly than that. But essentially, in a negative NAO, we get cooler and drier conditions in the UK. That's the key thing to take from this. And the North Atlantic Oscillation is a known driver for rainfall in the UK. It's used by the Met Office as an indicator for predicting future water resources and future droughts as well. We can represent the North Atlantic Oscillation as an index where positive equals wetter conditions in the UK and negative equals dry conditions in the UK. And if we put that index through our magic guitar tuner again, we get something that isn't exactly the same periodicity, the exact same period as what we find in terrestrial hydrology, but it is very similar. And since that we know that the North Atlantic Oscillation is a primary control on winter rainfall variability in the UK, it's starting to make sense that this 8-year cycle, the North Atlantic Oscillation, may be the ultimate cause for this 8-year cycle, 7 to 8 year cycle that we see in streamflow. So this conceptual model is starting to come together a little bit. We have an 8-year cycle in the NEO that produces an 8-year cycle in rainfall, and then that is propagated to produce an 8-year cycle in streamflow. So this unfathomed mystery, I think we're starting to pick apart a little bit. Okay, but how important are the cycles really? Another incredibly good question and well-timed question, because that leads on to my next slide. One thing we can do with this methodology is actually to quantify the amount of streamflow and rainfall behaviour that is accounted for by this 8-year cycle. So the percentage of the standard deviation variance of the data set that you can explain by using this 8-year cycle. And these graphs are a little bit hard to digest, so I've boxed them up for you. So I'm just going to focus on rainfall for the time being and have a look at Scotland here, North Scotland. So this is saying that 10 to 20% of rainfall variability in this area can be explained by this 8-year cycle. And I think that's, for rainfall, quite a high number. So imagine if you're building a scheme or built a scheme in these areas. So let's take, for example, a catchment that is primarily driven by rainfall, doesn't really have any rivers in the area. We're particularly looking at rainfall on the surface here. If we were to do a annual exceedance probability, that annual exceedance probability obviously only takes into account the long-term average, for want of a better way of putting it, of when and where those high magnitude events occur. But what we're saying by this is that we're potentially missing 20% of the information by using methodologies that make the assumption of seasonality being the most important. I'm going to go on in a couple of slides to bottom out that a little bit, but I think it's important to note that since so much of the funding for schemes, and I suppose I'm thinking more in terms of flood risk management, but this is equally true for other types of water resource management. Since so much of the financial implications and the financing for these schemes are tied up in how in the magnitude of the event that the scheme is protecting against, being able to identify a greater proportion of rainfall variability, I think leads perhaps to some interesting consequences. We'll talk about that in a little bit, I think. And just going around the UK, we've got sort of 10% in England and Northern Ireland. In streamflow in Scotland, we've got 10 to 20%. That kind of makes sense. Streamflow in Scotland is quite responsive to rainfall, so we would perhaps expect them to be quite similar. But what's really interesting is when we get into the south of England and we get into some of the more groundwater driven catchments, we start to see quite higher percentages, up to 30% in some of those areas. And this sort of makes sense really when we think about groundwater processes as a means of filtering out high frequency variability. What we actually managed to do is group these catchments by their base flow index and look at the average signal strength in each of these categories. And what we found is that the more base flow you have coming into your river, the more likely you are to have these stronger signals. And as I said, this makes sense in terms of how groundwater filters out high frequency variability and really amplifies those low frequency behaviors. So what's resultant is the result that's passed through to streamflow is a very focused, very concentrated 8-year cycle, which produces a higher strength in those groundwater driven streamflow catchments. This is just to show you the same spectra stacked on top of each other, but for 50-odd groundwater level boreholes in the UK. This is just to show that these signals exist in groundwater as well as streamflow. So we need to update our conceptual model to include this groundwater component because it's an important component in how these signals get to streamflow. We know that groundwater filter out these high frequency processes, so that's what would explain why in groundwater catchments we see such higher, such stronger signals in streamflow. Another question, what impact does it have on hydrologic streams? Well, another thing that we can do with this methodology, just reorientate ourselves back to this whole load of spectra stacked on top of each other. If we imagine not that each of these streamflow gauges is not streamflow, but is a song, say. For the sake of argument, let's call it a rock song because I know the instruments that go into rock songs. Each of these songs is slightly different. They all have their own subgenres. Some of them are faster, some of them are more violent, that kind of thing. They all contain the basic elements. A lot of them have some high frequencies in them, some singing. So a lot of them have, oh, you can't see my mouse, but let's call that the annual cycle. A lot of them have singing in. Some of them have guitars, some ukuleles, banjos, whatever, and the sort of mid frequencies, and they're all playing slightly different things. You know, each song's different. So everything between the 2 to 4 years, let's call that. But we get onto the lower frequencies, let's say bass guitar. We see that all of the streamflow gauges have bass guitar in them. And what we can do with this methodology is actually strip out all the other instruments and only listen to the bass guitar component. So we can actually convert that back into time data, back into sound data. We can split out, get rid of all the other instruments and just listen to what the bass guitar is playing in each of the songs across the UK. And this is what this looks like if you stack all of those bass guitar tracks on top of each other. And what this is showing is that not only do the majority of streamflow records in the UK have bass guitar in them, but actually when you listen to the bass guitar, each bass guitar is playing more or less the same thing. So this is obviously the 8-year component, the reconstructed 8-year component of those streamflow gauges, and all of the peaks within reason, all of the peaks and all of the troughs of this 8-year cycle align at the same time within a few years maybe. And perhaps with the exception of 1975 where it all goes a bit wonky. Now, given the high percentages, or in my opinion, high percentages, unexpectedly high percentages that this 8-year cycle accounts for in streamflow, the obvious question is, well, how does this compare to historical extremes, hydrological extremes? And what we've done is actually look at the widespread droughts and some flood instances. I'm going to focus on droughts in the first instance. Looked at some widespread droughts in the UK. And this principally does affect the south of England because that tends to be a more high drought risk area, particularly in the chalk. But if you overlay every instance of widespread drought in the UK over the past 60 odd years, you see that with the exception of 1975, each of these droughts occur at a minima of this 8-year cycle where we know things are drier. And that isn't necessarily to say that these droughts were the result of this 8-year cycle, but we can now say that a percentage of the magnitude of these events was the result of this 8-year cycle. The 8-year cycle is modulating how extreme these droughts are. Frustratingly, when we published this particular piece of information, we didn't really do it at the right time, because if we'd have done it a little bit earlier, we would have been able to have some foresight into the 2019-2020 drought and water scarcity period that we're currently still going through in some areas. But the fact that this is an 8-year repeating pattern obviously lends us to, gives us some degree of foresight into when may be drought-rich periods in the future. We can do a similar thing for flooding. This is the result of a Google search of main headline flood events that have affected Scotland in this example over the past 60 odd years. And we can see that I think all of these actually align with a positive phase of this 8-year cycle, where we have up to 20% more flow, higher flow than the long-term average. And again, this isn't to say that these floods wouldn't have happened if it weren't for this 8-year cycle and this potential teleconnection with the North Atlantic Oscillation, but a degree of the severity of these droughts may well be influenced by this 8-year cycle that we now can quantify and understand a little better. Oh, we're back to Tommy Frost. So, and back to the Bourne. Every 7th year it swells to an extraordinary manner. If we look at the reconstructed flow for, this isn't the Bourne, this is the Wandle again, but a proxy for the Bourne, and another Google on key flood events that have happened on the Bourne, all bar one line up with a maxima or a positive phase of this 8-year cycle. So this is a cycle that perhaps unknowingly has been to some degree affecting the severity and perhaps even the timing of flood events, potentially across the country, certainly in some areas. So what does all this mean for water management in the UK? I think there are two main implications for these cycles and this teleconnection. The first is scheme performance. Don't know why I changed my accent for performance there. Scheme performance, environmental or flood risk, and infrastructure investment. I'm just going to have a talk through each of these with some examples. So in the instance of scheme performance, for the sake of argument, let's say a fish passage. Let's say we build a fish passage here. And we know that under certain regulations, we need to ensure that that fish are allowed to pass through that structure, say at least 70% of the time. So those flow frequencies, those percentiles, are going to be based on the long-term average of the data set available. But that long-term average obviously doesn't account for any periodic behavior in the data set. So what that means is that after that scheme is built, there are going to be periods of underperformance and periods of overperformance. And I think this highlights one of the main areas that this is potentially useful in improving the monitoring of schemes. If we are able to understand that if we build our scheme in a minimum of this phase in 4 years' time, or half the cycle, we're going to be in a wet phase of this cycle, and we're going to be expecting more potentially lower performance of the scheme. That's obviously incredibly useful for managers of water resources, hydroecology, flood risk, to communicate that and potentially even build that into or take account into that in scheme design. The second benefit or implication is investment. So obviously, if you are a water company that is tasked with supplying water over a certain area, and you, let's say, for example, are reliant on groundwater abstraction, a lot of abstractions are dependent on environmental indicators such as streamflow. So having an idea of when and where within your catchment may be wetter or drier than average, and even where in your catchment may be more susceptible to these cycles, it's obviously incredibly useful for making the decision of when and where to invest in new infrastructure, or even the maintenance of existing infrastructure, and may even allow for better management of finances, better distribution of finances. And if we if the whole idea of water trading, inter-catchment water trading, becomes slightly more real, then this obviously would allow us to highlight catchments that are more resilient or less resilient to these cycles and manage our water resources more effectively. So, what's the time? 40 minutes, I think that's okay. To recap, we tend to think of streamflow as a result of three principles, I think. Behaviour as a result of storm events, the annual cycle and seasonality, and some sort of trend or maybe an increasing amplitude of the seasonal cycle as a result of the climate crisis. But what we're seeing now is actually streamflow is subject to multiple periodicities, multiple cycles. Some of them are strong enough to challenge seasonality, and in some cases are stronger than seasonality. In streamflow, we find up to 30% of the total behaviour can be explained by an 8-year cycle. In groundwater, it's 40%. And this cycle exists in rainfall, streamflow and groundwater, as I said, spring flow. It exists in many, many areas and many facets of the water cycle in the North Atlantic region. As a result, we think of the North Atlantic Oscillation. So I think we need to add this cycle into our conceptual model of streamflow behavior if we are to really utilize our water resources effectively and live with them as efficiently as possible. As I said, this cycle can account for up to 30% of streamflow behavior. And that's an average. That is a 30% of the standard deviation. It could be more than that for an 8-year period. But 30% is a huge number if we think about our tolerances for scheme design and what is permissible. If between the minima of the cycle and the maximum of the cycle, that's potentially a 60% increase in the average streamflow, which is a huge number. But a number that we can now quantify and have a better understanding of where to find these cycles. As I said, these cycles are comparable to seasonality. So the assumption that seasonality captures everything that we need to make the decisions is perhaps incorrect. And by including these cycles in at least how we monitor the performance of schemes, we can glean some benefit from them. And as I said, we can potentially use these cycles to improve our management of hydrological extremes. And that is it for me. Thank you very much. Oh, it's the start of it again. There's a couple of papers there. I'm sure we can sort out sending that out on a link if you're interested in more. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Well, that was very interesting. We do have a few questions, so I'll just sort of read them out to you, and you might actually be able to see them as well. Okay. And we can just go through those.
Sure.
So the first one, so it says that this is fascinating, as I can agree. Is it possible to say whether in a cycle a gauging station is so we might be able to predict floods or droughts? I suspect the answer is coming. Will this be muddled by climate change?
Yes, so I don't know exactly when you asked that question, but it may have been before this doodad here. Oh, too many slides. Yes, so the vast majority of the streamflow gauges in the UK share the same 8-year cycle. So the cycle is more or less the same regardless of where you are, with a few exceptions. So certainly, yes, we can tell where we are. At the moment, we are in a minima of the cycle. We're in a dry phase. The previous wet phase, well, the previous wet phase was 2014, that massive flooding that occurred over a lot of the UK. So yeah, we can definitely do that. And climate change, yes. We have no idea if these cycles are going to continue. We know that they've at least in some areas have influenced hydrology for the past 140 years. Thomas Frost says that it was known for centuries at the time of writing. So it's been known for centuries, that it's been apparent for centuries at least, that this 8-year cycle exists in some areas. So that is perhaps providence to suggest that it will continue, but we are at the mercy of climate change and what it's going to do to oscillatory climate systems like the North Atlantic Oscillation. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. Just to say that if on any of your questions you've got any sort of more questions on the back of your question being answered, just feel free to type them in the question and answer section, and we'll cover them as well. So just moving on to another question that we've got. So this one says, seeing the pattern in the UK, would it be possible to expect the opposite flooding and drought in France and Spain from the UK?
Yes, very good question. Not necessarily in France. France tends to share well, it depends where in France, but the chalk in France, the Paris Basin, tends to share a similar relationship to us. But places in the Iberian Peninsula do have an inverse relationship with the North Atlantic Oscillation. In fact, in honesty, some places in the southeast of England have an inverse relationship with the North Atlantic Oscillation. So yeah, we would expect that. One thing that we're going to be moving on to in the research is to broaden out this analysis to, well, at the moment, groundwater level, because that's where we find strongest signals, groundwater levels in Europe, to try and see and try and detect that, yeah, spatial change in these 8-year cycles.
Thank you for that. And another question that has just come through. So in the reconstructed cycles, the peaks and troughs appear to be in a diminishing phase. Even though flood events are getting more severe, could this be climate change? Should we fear future increased amplitude events?
Again, a very good question. And I think there's a distinction to be made here between, that's important to keep in mind in terms of the processes that drive flooding versus the processes that drive drought. Flooding is much more sensitive to short-term catchment conditions, say, whereas drought is obviously much more the result of a long-term trend. And that's why I really wanted to be as clear as I could when I said that we don't expect that these cycles to be ultimately responsible for flooding. We expect them to be influencing on the likely risk of flooding. So there's two different processes. Well, they're sort of linked. Climate change may affect these cycles because it may affect the NAO, but if we just split them up separately for the time being, there certainly was a strong period of a strong cycle in the NAO, sort of in the 1990 through to 2010, that we see to be diminishing now. How exactly we get from a cycle in the NAO to a statistical measure of the risk of flooding, I don't think we're quite there yet. And it may be, as you say, the case that climate change actually starts to influence things more and more. And we see a sort of two-phase relationship. I don't think we necessarily need to fear increased amplitude in the future. I mean, one of the biggest flood events in the south of the UK, at least for a long time, was the 2014 flood event, and that occurred at a relatively weak amplitude of this cycle. So I don't think it's necessarily, unfortunately, as easy as this cycle being a direct, the amplitude of this cycle being a direct reflection on the magnitude of events per se. But as I was saying, yeah, they are related. I don't know even if that answers your question, but hopefully it does.
I think, well, to myself, I think that covered it very well. If there are any more questions, just pop it in. We've just got another one as well. So just sort of how would you propose to integrate these findings into water companies' annual plans, management plans, to help them sort of manage their water supplies?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the big question, really. There are a lot of, in terms of policy, a lot of them don't line up terribly well. They're generally 5 years. A lot of the thing for flood management and drought management is well, the minimum is 5 years. Sorry, the maximum is 5 years. That a lot of these plans need to be rewritten. That doesn't necessarily line up very well with what is an 8-year cycle or a 7-year cycle. But I think it comes down to a catchment level. I mean, all of this has been very wide scale, but I think really if we come down to a catchment level and look at individual environmental indicators and individual abstractions, say, I think being aware that in a particular area, and this is something we're able to show, not necessarily by just measuring, taking groundwater level measurements and doing this analysis, we're actually able to draw some relationships between the type of groundwater and how strong these signals are. So we are able to, on some level, to start to screen certain locations that might be more vulnerable to these cycles. I don't even want to say vulnerable because it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's another tool to allow us to better understand the variability. I think I'm struggling to answer that question because I don't have an answer to it. I think what we need to move on now in the research project is perhaps to do more engagement to understand exactly, you know, in a practical sense, how can these cycles be used in the better management of resources. But I do believe that it's going to come down to catchment scale, even abstraction location scale, and really digging down into the variability of that data set and trying to pick out what facets of that can be used to better make decisions.
I think that's an excellent answer, actually. It's just sort of highlighting the awareness that we've got to raise, and that gradually, I think, over time and probably, as you say, more research, we'll be able to incorporate these within actual management plans, which will be very useful. We just have a follow-up question from the question on France and Spain. So just to go over that one, is this knowledge being shared with those countries? Seeing as you said the UK is currently in drought, it could be good for them to know that they are in a peak phase. So just how is this knowledge being shared?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually had a call with the European Groundwater Drought Initiative this morning, which brings together hydrologists and academics from 15 odd countries in Europe, and it gave a very similar presentation to this. So yeah, we are engaging with the wider countries in Europe to try and see, well, first of all, so that they're aware of it, but also gathering data so that we can actually analyze and see how far the spatial extent of these signals extend and where they're inverted and how that actually relates to the water use of the area. Yeah.
So we have another question on a similar topic. So are you aware of any similar studies or examples being carried out overseas? Would be especially interested to know if there are anything from Australia or New Zealand where water resource issues are a main concern. It would seem that this type of study would be very useful to inform water resource planning.
Yes, in all honesty, regarding Australia and New Zealand, I'm not aware of any. There are a lot in North America, in the USA. They have a slightly different set of climate cycles that affect them. El Nino is one of them, but they have multi-decadal oscillations that affect them. And they've been doing similar research. There's obviously slight differences, but this is it's a methodology that really started originally. The methodology, I think, was used in banking to look at investment trends or something like that. But it is a methodology that has been picked up by hydrologists and hydrogeologists to look at long-term variability, and certainly in the USA, it's been something that's been looked into. You know, in the High Plains aquifer as well, they're finding some very long-term cycles and some quite strong cycles. I mean, everything's bigger in America. It's the cycles are way stronger. So they've been found. But it'd be interesting to know, because obviously Australia is very influenced by ENSO, El Nino, Southern Oscillation, which has a 2 to 3 year cycle. So it'd be very interesting to see how detectable the periodicity of the El Nino ENSO is in Australia and New Zealand water resources. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer, Will. We've just got another question here as well. So this person says, it would be interesting to see if there was a correlation to cold and worst winters. From school, everyone of my era remembers the 1995 cold snap. Speaking to others, there is a generational standout bad winters. Perhaps the bad winters will correlate with the middle of the central line of the reconstructed cycles.
Yeah, quite possibly. That's something that we haven't looked into directly, temperature. So we've looked at potential evapotranspiration, which has a temperature driver, but we didn't actually find any interesting signals there. But given our conceptual understanding of how the North Atlantic Oscillation works, one of the reasons that it produces so much wetter conditions in the UK is because it produces so much warmer conditions in the UK. It intensifies the Gulf Stream, which, as you know, is one of the main reasons, well, the main reason that we're not the same temperature as Canada, essentially. So it would be very interesting to see that. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think. Obviously, the processes that drive these strong signals in streamflow is in part a function of terrestrial hydrology's ability to filter out high frequency variability. So it'd be interesting to see, because I guess there would be a filtering to some extent, because obviously things take a while to warm up. So different elements would have a different filtering effect. So it would be interesting to see that. But at the moment, it's not something that we've looked at directly, but would be very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer there. We've just got another one here. So as sort of coming back to the topic of introducing this research into water companies and how they may adopt it, do you think that this research may narrow the schemes that companies are building, because they've got more sort of a degree of where the systems are going, and to what degree that they need to be sized, or the protection that they need to offer?
It's a good point, because at the moment we are essentially blind to these cycles, because our entire workflow for managing this does not take into account variability, periodic variability at a greater than annual scale. And we bolt on climate change as a percentage increase, which, I mean, you can argue how good that is or not, but I don't know whether it would narrow it. I don't know. I think for it to make obviously people, companies and schemes are always going to be built to the requirements set out to them. So if there's no requirement to take account of these cycles, then maybe it's a bit of a pessimistic view, but I would say the majority of them probably still wouldn't, because of that blind spot to these cycles. So whether scheme implementation would change a whole lot without some sort of acknowledgement in policy for taking into account different types of variability, I'm not sure. But I think it comes down again to a very local scale and a catchment scale. You can definitely think about, and also it comes down to the lifespan of schemes. And if we're talking about investment in infrastructure, how long does that investment last? If it's a temporary measure and it only lasts 8 years or less, then when you build that temporary measure is obviously massively important, because that is within a scale. Suddenly that's within a scale that you can start working with this scheme. So for instance, if you're having to build temporary flood alleviation whilst you do works elsewhere, knowing where to do this may save you, pushing it back, I doubt this, but pushing it back by 2 years may save you. There may be a business justification to say that, well, our risk is actually going to be perhaps 20% less if we push it back by 2 years, which will mean that we don't need to build quite as much, or we do need to build slightly more. So I think there's definitely routes that temporary works can change. That's quite clear to me. But exactly how permanent works change, I'm interested to see whether what we can do with that. I think that's going to be a challenge, but one that I'm hoping we can make some headway with.
No, thank you for that. It'll be interesting to see where this research goes to, and sort of how water companies and different countries as well are able to adopt and undertake this. So if anyone has got any more questions, please send them through. We'll just hold off for a couple of minutes just in case any more. Oh, we've got another one coming through actually. So this one is, have you shared your results with the UK? Oh, sorry, that just jumped away. Have you shared your results with the UK water companies, especially in the southeast of England, and what has been their response?
So we've done 2 studies to date, one that has looked at groundwater level and one that has looked at stream flow. We've actually found that the stream flow one has elucidated a lot more about groundwater than we expected, and about the processes of groundwater, and identified a much, so essentially previously, oh, I'm clicking through on the wrong screen. The paper that's in publication at the moment is this paper. And this is the first paper that really shows the spatial distribution and sensitivities of these cycles. So whilst we did some engagement on the previous paper, that previous paper only looked at 50 groundwater level gauges across the UK. So what we're getting to, and this is what the next set of papers is planning to be on, is can we develop a set of information that can be immediately picked up by water companies to start to screen their assets and start to screen the catchments that they undertake. As I said, we've gone to, I've spoken about this with the Environment Agency, and I've spoken about this with 1 or 2 water companies, but I think we're really at the stage now where we're trying to open up and get as much engagement with water companies as we can. So if there's any water companies listening, I'm more than happy to come and give a presentation, I guess.
Hopefully they're all ears and they'll be snapping you up. So just, if anyone's got any more questions, please just send them through. But in the meantime, is it possible, Will, for you to post the links to the papers within the chat section?
Yes,
just so we've had a couple of questions if people could have those. So if we could just do that, then
okay,
they're
sure.
there for people to have a look at. And yeah, if anyone's got any more questions that you think of after the presentation, then sort of please feel free to email them across, and we can get those answered. Yeah, I think if there's no more questions for today, then thank you very much, Will. That was a very interesting presentation, and I think we're all very intrigued as to see how this research develops, and sort of how the water companies adopt this sort of worldwide as well. So yes, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending, and looking forward to seeing you all at our next event. So thank you.